May I begin by warmly congratulating whoever decided to schedule an economic and financial conference at the end of this past week. It showed foresight of an almost astrological order. Maybe some country should ask him to be its finance minister. It also forced most of us to rewrite our speeches. Well, some perhaps more rewriting than others. What we have lived through this past week has been a lesson in practical economics. As my favorite poet wrote, "Let us admit it frankly, as a business people should. We've had no end of a lesson, it will do us no end of good." It has been, in particular, a lesson for governments. The role of government in trade and commerce, as in much else, is to create a framework of stability within which enterprise can flourish. But the rigid stability of fixed exchange rates threatened to stifle enterprise and obstruct commerce. It required heavy burdens to be placed on companies, including efficient companies. It made imports artificially cheap and exports artificially expensive. It starved firms of capital. It was bad for business, and it meant that home owners watched anxiously as the cost of their investment rose inexorably. Yet the stability which fixed rates offered was a false one. It prevented currencies from adjusting gradually to market realities, and in the end, it produced wild swings of instability. There's nothing new about fixed exchange rates collapsing. What might be new is to finally learn the lesson that fixed rates don't and can't work in free markets. So I congratulate John Major and Norman Lamont for taking off this economic straitjacket and letting the pound find a level at which it can be sustained without imposing intolerable burdens and disrupting economic life. Not all political leaders have shown such realism. In 1931, a Labour government lost power through trying to stick to an overvalued rate of exchange. When the incoming national government went off gold and floated the pound, a member of the previous Labour government said plaintively, "They never told us we could do that." That minister would have been extremely popular with the European Commission. Just imagine the things they wouldn't have told him he could do. Meanwhile, in Britain, attempts to shadow the Deutschmark attracted funds into the country and expanded the money supply further. Inflation duly occurred. Among its effects were rises in asset and property prices, large-scale borrowing on inflated assets, and what the British columnist William Rees-Mogg called the financing of nonsense. Nonsense can't be sustained. In due course, governments had to prick this inflationary bubble with monetary restraints and high interest rates. When they did so, property prices fell, over-debted businesses went broke, homeowners received larger mortgage bills, and the euphoric expectation that asset values would go on rising forever suddenly evaporated. Recession followed that inflation. Fixed exchange rates, now embodied in the ERM, were having a damaging secondary effect. They acted as a transfer mechanism, transmitting the problems of one country to its partners in the system. Germany's reunification had been purchased with a vast injection of money into East Germany, financed by borrowing. That duly threatened inflation throughout that country. To prevent this, the Bundesbank raised interest rates, and through the perverse alchemy of the ERM, Germany's anti-inflationary pressure was transformed into deflation throughout the rest of Europe. Nations like Britain have found themselves raising interest rates in a recession. Real interest rates in Britain this week, real interest rates, rose to over 10%. But in the end, reality was bound to burst through these barriers. And this week, Britain resumed control of its own economic destiny. This recession is attacking healthy and profitable, efficient companies, generally those of small or medium size, and it is doing so savagely. Personal bankruptcy and company liquidations in Britain are running at levels significantly higher than those of early recessions. For all these reasons, the psychology of this downturn is different. When I was navigating my way through the 1982 recession, I found that people understood that certain fundamental changes were necessary and in fact overdue, that there had to be an economic restructuring and a transformation of industry to fit it for the information age. People will endure hardships if they understand the reason for them and if they can see that the changes will make it better for the future. But they find the same hardships intolerable when they have done all the right things, when companies have invested in new technology, when homeowners have taken out mortgages at interest rates which seemed reasonable at the time, when workers on the factory floor have cooperated in better working practices, and when they still find themselves out of work, bankrupt, or facing repossession. And when the recession seems not only inexplicable, but is also prolonged beyond the time they had been led to expect, then they tend to lose hope and confidence in the future. Yet, if I may coin a phrase, Mr. Chairman, we have nothing to fear but fear itself. What we have seen this week is not the destruction of European unity and international cooperation, but the inevitable collapse of rigid economic structures that could not accommodate change and diversity, did not reflect popular wishes, and inflicted unnecessary recessions. As the rise in the London share market demonstrated, we in Britain have been liberated. We are now free to pursue an economic policy that will reduce interest rates to stimulate recovery, as the Fed has done here. More vital, we in the West as a whole are free to devise looser, more flexible, but more durable arrangements for European and international cooperation. Flexible exchange rates, free trade under a revived GATT, incorporating all the countries of the Pacific Rim, a Europe of nation-states encompassing the new democracies of Central Europe, a more active assistance to Russia by the IMF and the G7 countries, and continuing United States leadership of a NATO prepared to uphold international law in and out of area and strengthened by moves towards transatlantic free trade. We have it in our power today to establish a framework of stability for the world economy so that world enterprise can flourish. May I now deal in more detail with the last few days of turbulence, the effective devaluation of the pound sterling, and the future of the EMS exchange rate mechanism. It was not the collapse of the British government's policy, but the policy itself which was the problem. It may be embarrassing to go back on a pledge to defend a particular exchange rate, come hell or high water. But if the pledge was misguided in the first place, The act of breaking it should provoke a round of applause, not condemnation. There's no point in the opposition parties in Britain, or indeed in most of the government's other critics, saying, "I told you so." Not least because they said nothing of the sort. Indeed, they constantly urge the Prime Minister and Chancellor to embrace monetary union even more rigidly and with greater doctrinaire commitment to the idea of European integration. I would not have had sterling enter the narrow band, and I would not have gone any further towards a single currency. Of course, if you're trying to prove to the world, and perhaps yourself, that you can move forward from the wide band of the ERM towards a single currency, you're forced to pursue quite a different policy. You have to go on defending the currency whatever happens, or at least until your reserves and other countries' patience runs out. And as we have seen, you fail even at that. The real question now is whether it is either possible or desirable to get back to that limited degree of exchange rate coordination and management in Europe, which was the original intention of the ERM. My own view is that it is not. It might in theory be possible to have an ERM which is regarded as something more like a gold standard than a halfway stage to a single European currency. But I doubt it. Old habits die hard. The Federalists will use it to keep pushing towards a single currency. It will tempt politicians and bankers again to treat the exchange rate as a kind of virility symbol. And I must say that for myself, I never felt the need for a virility symbol. The third lesson concerns the Maastricht Treaty, aimed at creating a European Union. Even before the unnerving events of the last few days, I believe that sentiment in European, and particularly Britain, was moving against ratification. It is already difficult for people to harbour affection for Maastricht. Indeed, the government itself considered our exemption from EMU and the social chapter to be its main negotiating success, and yet urged the French to endorse the treaty without those same exemptions. People were also indignant that the French were allowed a referendum while we were denied one. It's high time to make as complete a reversal of policy on Maastricht as has been done on the ERM. And of course, the connection is very close economically and politically. If the divergence between different European economies is so great that even the ERM cannot contain them, how could those economies possibly react to a single currency? The answer is that there would be chaos and resentment of the sort that would make the difficulties of recent days pale by comparison. Huge sums would have to be transferred from richer to poorer countries and regions to allow them to take the strain. Even then, unemployment and mass migration across now open frontiers would follow, and a full-fledged single currency would allow no escape hatch. The political consequences can already be glimpsed. The growth of extremist parties, battening on fears about mass immigration and unemployment, offering a real, if thoroughly unwelcome, alternative to the Eurocentrist political establishment. If in addition you were to create a supranational European federation, and the people could no longer hold their national parliaments to account, extremism would only grow further. It is time for European politicians to sit up and take note. Time to stop their endless rounds of summits. Summitry is fast becoming a substitute for decision-making, and time to observe the reality around them. There's a growing sense of remoteness, an alienation of people from their institutions of government and their political leaders. There is a fear that the European train will thunder forward, laden with its customary cargo of gravy, towards a destination neither wished for nor understood by electorates. But the train can be stopped. Mr. Chairman, to some people, these last few days may have seemed like a nightmare. But that is a wrong perception. The trauma and the turbulence have brought home to governments the limits of their ability to shape the world on lines of political convenience. That is profoundly healthy. This was the week when the British and other economies broke free of largely self-imposed constraints. And as a result, new possibilities have opened up, not just to end our recessions, but for more enduring and productive international cooperation. The histrionics of this time will soon be forgotten. The benefits will be increasingly appreciated. Dire warnings of what will happen when the economic straitjacket is removed will quickly prove false. The patient may perhaps wave his arms around a bit at first. He may even make a noise. But his odd behavior reflects the torture of the straitjacket, not an inherent disordered condition. And the long-concealed truth quickly dawns that this patient was perfectly sane all the time. Mr. Chairman, let us never again forget that the market has its own spontaneous order on which the most effective economic cooperation will always be based. Free trade, flexible exchange rates, domestic policies to encourage enterprise and sound money. These amount to an open international system of cooperation that can accommodate both the dynamic capitalist economies of the Far East and the new democracies of Eastern Europe, struggling towards a market order. And on that foundation, let us go forward to overcome the remaining obstacles to our prosperity and progress, bringing a better, stabler, and freer future within our grasp. Thank you.